Hi, chess kids.
Hello.
My name is Alexandra Botez, although you probably know me as FriendlyQueen. And today I have another exciting lesson for you guys. We're going to be looking at pawn structures. In particular, we're going to be learning whether it's best to stay with our
Hello.
pawn, push another pawn, or capture. So, for example, in our first position, this is from the French defense, and white has three options here. The first is to stay with the pawn on e4 and play knight c3 to protect it. The second option is to exchange and play e takes d5, e takes d5. And the third option is to push and to play e5 here. Now, take a step back. All of these options are actually good, and they're all opening variations. So in our lesson today, we're going to look at positions that the right answer is more clear and figure out whether we should stay, push, or capture. In our first position, we already reached the endgame, and white just played d2, d4, allowing black to have to decide whether it's best to keep his pawn on e5, to capture on d4, or to come closer with the king. In this position, black said, I'm going to take on d4. Now, this is a bad move. The reason why this is a problem is because it creates a very weak square on d6. After white plays king e2, f6, king d3, king f7, king takes d4, and king e6, now black is going to be tied to the d6 pawn for the rest of the game, while white has two pawn islands with a2, b2, e4, f2, g2, and h2. So moving back a little bit, we're going to try to figure out what would have been a better move for black. Instead of e takes d4, another possibility would have been to play g6 with the idea of f5, king f7, and king e6. This way, he wouldn't create an additional weakness on d6. In our second position, we've reached the endgame again, and white has the option of keeping the pawn on d4, taking on e5, or pushing d5. So to think for a second what the best move is, we want to think about the consequences if we would capture the pawn or if we would decide to keep it on d4. So white decides to calculate and figures out that d takes e5 is the best move. After d takes e5, white has two good options here. Now that he's exchanged pawns, one thing he can do is take the rook on d8, and after king takes d8, now the black king has gone backwards in the endgame, and the white king is more powerful. The other option is if white decides to play rook d5, rook takes d5, e takes d5, king d6, and king e4, and now the white king is once again more active in the endgame, and white benefited from taking the pawn on e5 and exchanging. In our third position, I thought I should switch it up and show you guys an opening instead. Here, it's black's turn to move, and he pushes c5. White, once again, has three options. He can choose to keep the tension and keep the pawn on d4. He can push d5, or he can play d takes c5. So let's look at d takes c5 as the first option. If white plays d takes c5, the queen takes on d1, king takes on d1, and now white can't castle anymore, and black is going to be able to re-win the pawn on c5 after playing something like e6 and putting more pressure on it if he wants with knight a6. So instead, white has to decide between d5 or protecting the pawn and keeping the tension with a move like e3 or knight f6. White decides that e3 is the best move here. The reason is that if black plays c takes d4, white can take back with the pawn on d4, and he brings another pawn to the center while also opening his light squared bishop. Our last position is a more tricky one, but I think you guys are ready for the challenge. Here, we can see that white has a pawn on c5, and once again, three options to keep the pawn on c5. He can either take on b6 or on d6, or he can push c6. Now, before deciding which move is best, it's good to look a little bit at what white's plan is and what black's plan is. Here, black has a very strong kingside attack and is thinking about moves like g4, queen g5, and continuing the attack on white's king. White, on the other hand, has a strong queenside attack and has to decide what's the best way to continue attacking the queenside, especially with the consideration of what to do with the pawn on c5. Here, the best move is to play c takes b6. After c takes b6, white can continue the attack with b5. But let's go back a little bit and see what would have been another possibility that's not as good so that we can make sure we wouldn't make that same mistake if we had this position. The other possibility is c6. After knight f6, we notice that although white has a very strong pawn chain, white has closed off his position and it's a lot harder to attack the queen side now, while black still has more flexibility and the options of pushing the g5 and h5 pawn. So just to go back a little bit, the best move here would have been instead c takes b6, c takes b6, and continuing the attack. Well, that was the last example, and I was hoping that the same theme of deciding whether to stay, push, or capture would help show you guys some positions. However, as we know, with a lot of chess games, it's hard to find a rule that fits all positions. So whenever you're playing your game, and trying to decide between these three options, always try to think about it in terms of consequences. What's going to happen if you stay with your pawn, if you push it, or if you capture? And then, as you start to see more positions, you'll start to know which is the best option.